Well, welcome back, everyone. Good to see you all back here. So, we talked about every possible angle of energy and conservation-related issues, some environmental issues, and so on in the first half of the time. But I think first of all, there were, I think, many things I still wanted to talk about. I know there are a few that I was curious about. And, you know, we're having a conversation among scholars and practitioners, and that leaves the question, okay, so how does anything that we're talking about get beyond this room? And while we're sort of aware that these are, I mean, we're probably even congenitally aware as scholars of a region, or people who focus on a particular region, that most of the world doesn't really quite get it. And I think that's something that became clearer as this post-communism roundtables approached their second decade, that we need to think really about how we take what we know and bring it into the classroom, and also, for that matter, to the public. And so the format we have adopted to address that is to create this second panel discussion around pedagogical issues. And you know, that very phrasing sort of scares one away. When we talk about pedagogical issues, you know, we're going to start talking about learning styles and God knows what, and we all feel unqualified. But there are very real questions that we all deal with as practitioners of a different sort. And therefore, we have with us three guests, all from universities elsewhere in Indiana, doing interesting things there in their universities, in different disciplines as well, I might add. In fact, that's actually kind of neat that not only do our experts represent or have expertise primarily in three different countries, but they do represent three different disciplines at these three universities. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they are listed on our website, and if they choose to go in a different order, that is great, but here it is. So first of all, in the center of our panel is Jimin Lee, who is an associate professor of political science and chair of the Chinese and Japanese Studies program at Valparaiso University, which is up in the extreme, or near extreme northwest of Indiana. Jimin Lee has a PhD from the University of Washington. He researches Chinese politics and international relations in the Asia-Pacific area, and he's now working on two book projects, one focusing on China's changing relations between the center and the provinces, and the other on the prospect of modernization of China's diplomacy. To his left is Sergei Zhuk, who is Associate Professor of History at Ball State University. He was, before that, a Professor of American History at Dnipropetrovsk University in Ukraine. Came here in 1997, where he defended a second dissertation at Johns Hopkins, this time on Russian. Was it, I mean, technically Russian history, but really
Russian, European, but technically Ukrainian.
Exactly, that's right. It doesn't say PhD in Russian history on your diploma. And he is best known, and I might say widely known already, for his most recent book, Rock and Roll in the Rocket City, The West, Identity and Ideology in Soviet Dnipropetrovsk, 1960 to 1985, as well as his previous work, Russia's Lost Reformation, Peasants and Radical Religious Sects in Southern Russia and Ukraine, 1830 to 1905. And he's now working on a book on the social and cultural history of American studies in Russia and Ukraine after Stalin. And over on the other side of the panel is Andrew Buck, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Southern Indiana, which is down at the very southwestern tip of the state in Evansville. And I just learned that before coming to Southern Indiana, he was at Reading University in the UK. He has interests in Russian society, economic sociology, political sociology, and social network analysis, and has published in a wide variety of journals on these issues. His PhD is from Columbia, right?
Right.
Yes, from Columbia University, and belongs to that last generation and say they studied in the Soviet Union. Yes, as can I, just barely as well. All right, I think without further ado, I turn over, and so they're going to each talk about their experience of teaching on these issues, and then we'll all be able to join in and talk as well. All right, over to you.
Okay, I'll try to be true to my task here is talk about the pedagogical challenges of teaching issues like energy and conservation in China or in post-communist countries. I teach a course, actually, public policy, once every 2 years, and next year I'm going to teach another public policy course on China. We choose 2 or 3 cases, and I may choose the energy issue, especially nuclear energy issue, largely because of the work I've done the last couple of weeks, try to get a new angle into the study of policy making in China and so forth. Despite its enormity and proximity to Japan, the Fukushima nuclear disaster has relatively little impact in China, at least on surface. There were some sensational stories about that. There was a panic buying of idolized salt, allegedly helping you deal with nuclear radiation. On the hand, there were some more substantial move on the part of Chinese government. There's a 1-year moratorium to suspend the approval of new power plants. Although those who are operational will not be affected, they are subject to a fairly extensive security check and so forth. And there were very few publications. In fact, I was in China last couple of weeks and check all the bookstores and say usually Chinese are pretty good at anniversaries and so forth. To my disappointment, I look at the Beijing bookstore, there are only 2 books on the lessons can learn from the nuclear disaster in Japan and so forth. There were only 1 in the bookstore in Hangzhou. There were some fairly detailed academic and articles on the courses and impact, but not to the extent that even reached the level of anything close to any major anniversaries and so forth. Despite the relative scant attention to the incident, China actually has all too very large stake in the issue of nuclear energy issue in general, and nuclear energy is part of that. There are a couple of things that that come to mind for anybody who studied the issue of energy issue in China. So it's not just the energy issue, it's an issue of reflecting a mirror of many concurrent issues and challenges China is facing. The first is obviously how to meet the rising demand for energy. I think India is not far away from China, but China certainly has the biggest demand for energy at this moment. And this is projecting to be even more so in the years to come. In 2009, China has already surpassed the United States to become the largest consumer of energy. And a lot of estimates suggest that by 2035, China is going to consume more than 50% of the energy produced by the world. The second challenge is energy security. Energy has always tied to security. I heard talk about Russians talk about energy is so critical to the national security, to the well-being of the economy. Japan, at least historically, until recently, has held nuclear energy as critical to its energy independence. But Chinese view energy security more than just an issue of economic security. It's a national security in the sense that the Chinese saw itself as a rising power competing with a relatively hostile environment in an unfriendly territory dominated by West. So for the Chinese, the supply of energy, the security of supply of energy is one of the top concerns for the national security. If United States or hostile forces try to choke China, energy certainly would be a very convenient weapon to do so, whether this is true or not. So the Chinese, every time they talk about energy, they have a very strong sense of vulnerability, not in terms of disrupting economic activities, but view this as a strategic weakness of the Chinese power. When I say also only 2 books about Chinese energy, actually there were probably 10 or 20 books talk about Chinese energy warfare. Not so much of energy policy, but how China has to do what it can to take back the South Sea, the potential source of energy, try to establish long-term, even military establishment in other countries to secure the transportations of the energy to China and so forth. So a lot of attention was put into this energy security issue, not just from economic, but from a strategic point of view as well. China actually is relatively self-sufficient in energy supply in the totality. Less than 10% of energy China consumes is imported. But in one area, the oil sector, Chinese dependency on oil actually is greater than United States, and it's going to be even higher. In 2000, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, the dependency of import oil is roughly about 30%. Now it's 56%. So China become increasingly concerned about energy policy, not just the energy supply, but how does that affect China's national security or the core interest, as the leaders tend to say. The third issue, obviously, is environment. There's very practical way to see, to smell the connection between energy consumption and environment. All you need to do is just land in Beijing for a couple of minutes. You feel an urge to spit. The air quality is that thick, especially for people who are not living in China long. Probably you live there for a long time, you get used to it, so become more sort of immune, or at least less sensitive to that kind of things. So the Chinese become increasingly alarmed by the environmental impact of the use of energy. Previously, coal is the major culprit of all the problems China face, black smoke and all the consequences. And now, the exhaustion from car become a major source of this is called a fine particle 2.5, the most controversial issue about China today. Most talk about on the web how these little particles can go into your lungs and cause your children to die prematurely or elderly to die early, and all those consequences and so forth. I was told that China actually today has 20 world-class stations monitoring PM 2.5, ready to go or about to ready to go to monitor exactly what caused this, especially concerning large cities and so forth. So the energy use is tied not only to the energy itself, but the consequences on environment and so forth. The fourth challenge is obviously the safety concern. Not so much Chinese leaders care about the deaths of miners who work in the ground or explosion caused by misuse of energy, but rather by the fear of a large-scale disaster, something to the extent of the Japanese Fukushima nuclear disaster. Last summer, this time, the Chinese experienced a train crash, fast train at a very low speed. But that incident has caused such a pool of national outcry that the Chinese completed highway plan has been derailed, and a couple of heads were rolled. So the Chinese leaders are very conscious about the consequences, potential real, of public disasters. And nuclear power plant certainly is one of the major concerns. Not so, but also reservoir dams. Sure Peter mentioned that as well. So the Chinese has linked to the energy use, not only in terms of the safety of productions and transportation, but also the potential consequences if anything related to energy will cause the public to be panicked and share their anger at the government and so forth. Then, of course, there's a politics behind any energy policies. Energy is so closely tied to the living standard of the people. Oil, gas price increase in China used to be pretty much written off by the government, subsidized, and now the government has to increase the prices based on the prices every 24 days. And the only energy prices, especially the reason the 7% increase last month has caused such a widespread public outcry that energy, how to preserve them, how to produce, how to secure them, make it affordable has also become a major political issue as well. Conservation, finally. The Chinese has talked about conservation. It's not true that China has a really poor record throughout those last 30 years. In fact, most studies find that in the 20 years of reform, the Chinese, what they call energy intensity, energy use per unit of GDP has decreased annually by some 5%. So it become more efficient in terms of use energy, although they use a lot more. It's just GPA, as one of the cases, that GPA has expanded so rapidly, so the energy efficiency in China, in that sense, has improved. The problem is, starting from 2000, the Chinese the energy intensity has increased by some 3%, 3.5% annually. And that has coincided with the most recent round of economic boom. A lot of things we saw China become really the superpower economic who has actually taken place the last 10 years, coupled with the large scale of urbanizations, the fast improving infrastructures, the heavy industrializations, and so forth. So the 10 years of Warner economic growth is also carrying a heavy price on energy and on the energy use and so forth. So this is really an interesting topic. I think our students deserve to know more about it. The question is how you're going to teach it. As I said, I teach a public policy course, and public policy in China, I don't think it's offered very widely in this country, even though public policy course in general is popular in any schools offers American studies or American government or public administration courses, largely because it is difficult to teach a country as large as China. You really have to study many, many years, know a lot of things in order to teach it. It's a big elephant. It's hard to teach it. Give one semester of time spent and so forth. There's also lack of tax and so forth. There are a lot of monographs about Chinese public policy issues, environmental policies, but there are very few books. At least I don't have any books under public policy or introduction to China public policy. Largely because it's such a complicated issue. And has to do with the issue, the huge demand to get materials in place and so forth. And to teach that is even more difficult because I taught 3 times the public policy. To teach a public policy course for a small school like us, it carries even more difficult challenges. One is that Our student body is pretty diverse. It's a small, comprehensive university, so my students come from nursing school, engineering school, business schools, or traditional students interested in humanities and science students. So they each come in with a different demand. They want looking at different aspects, and small classes very small, so it's very difficult to come up with the common themes that everybody can associate with. The second challenge, at least I felt, is that it's really hard to utilize the current theories, approaches to analyze things in China. This is certainly true for many other area studies. You have this so-called travel problems. When you use a theory, it goes beyond the bound. It's not what it's supposed to be, and it becomes really a watered-down operation. A lot of theories are based on Western experience. When you have a high degree of transparency government, you know the rules, the operational rules. You have high level reliability of data and so forth. When you study Chinese public policy, you really have to be cautious about everything you read and everything you receive. So how you apply the theories to a case studies without theory, obviously it's hard to create a framework so people can analyze relatively on the same page. On the hand, when you use these theories, whether it's decision-making theory, public policy, process theories, you name it. There were 10, 12 different theories I can use, but very few can be used properly for those kind of courses. It's not so much lack of data. Actually, surprisingly, Chinese now has a publication boom. There are data everywhere. All you need is to look for it. The problem is that most of it in Chinese, and very few are translated into English. And for those Chinese own translation, you actually you have more mistakes in translation than you can actually get the actual sense of what the original version was. Fortunately, we have a fairly strong Chinese program at both undergraduate level. So, and also the fact that we have over 200 native speakers of Chinese, so quite a few of them take those courses. So we can use students to help with the data and so forth. The issue obviously is how to get to a different methodology to analyze and so forth. I think I have less than 5 minutes, so I'll just give you a sense of what I plan to do next year. This Chinese response to the Japanese nuclear disaster actually created a very interesting window to look at how the Chinese politics worked. It's a real incident in which you have a very heavy-handed government who regulate everything about nuclear energy. Okay? The approving process is very meticulous, very complicated, and more by the rules than any other Chinese decision can think of. And also they use large amount of experts, so it's not just a decision made by some bureaucrats or politicians, as part of their whim, but it really has to do with scientific research and decision. So it's one of the real cases where you actually see a less institutionalized process where decisions made. Because of this, you have a chance to look at all the players into this. As I mentioned, the Chinese has temporarily suspended approval. They still have not lifted approval yet, lifted the ban yet, despite all the predictions. It's very interesting to look at from January to this year to now, is all the people who for the resumptions had already began to use media, use the two major national conference, the NPCs and so forth, to send a message that this is a given. It's just a matter of time. On the other hand, there are also people within the government, outside government, grassroots level, put pressure on the government to slow down the process. That's why the expected lift of the ban has not appeared yet. So why this is the case? What does that tell you about the nature of Chinese politics? Is China the authoritarian system, the almighty state, as we lead to believe, or it's become more fractured? Has more to do with compromise, a conflict, as we saw in more mature democracies. Has public policy become much more a multidimensional process rather than just a top-down process? So it gave us a chance to look at it, and fortunately for us, in the last couple months, we have enough materials to, if we have 12 students, each of them will play a very important role. The head of the Chinese Nuclear Security Safety Agency, the head of Chinese province, in the province, as Shapiro mentioned, someone mentioned about China has not yet built a nuclear power station inland yet. They have 3 sites, one in Hunan, Hubei, and Jiangxi. So they are the provinces who want to have the first inland nuclear plant. But there are differences, there are competing views on this, so create a very interesting case study for us to make. What I'd like to accomplish, if you could just give me 2 more minutes to finish, is to create courses that I would like to call the 3 R's. Number 1, a course that student can relate it to. Not something that just about China, something they can use their previous training and so forth. The second R is that they have the ability to respond well. In other words, not only they can relate to, but they can elevate the understanding. They can give them a topic, they can respond it significantly better than they had before. And finally, the third R is to help students redefine their own perspective, because China presents interesting cases. We can look in the mirror of the United States too, but how do we go back to the same challenge the United States faced 40, 50 years ago? We don't have the kind of lab to re-experience that, but China provides the best lab and give you a sense of how would you deal with this issue, many competing interests and so forth. So I'm really excited about this round table discussion, gave me a lot of new ideas of how to improve these courses, and I hope that when I do this, offer this course, the students will benefit from all the insights that I received today. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zhu, you're on.
I included issues of the energy conservation in courses which I teaching at Ball State. The first course is my favorite course, Soviet and Post-Soviet History. I have 2 lectures and 2 seminars on these issues, especially issues of Chernobyl and the post-Soviet development of Chernobyl tragedy in both Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and other post-Soviet states, including Lithuania and Latvia as well. I have only 2 lectures on energy conservation for my survey course called The West in the World. And later on I will explain strategy which I'm using for these courses. And based on my new research on this new book about personal history of Soviet Americanists, especially in American studies in Russia and Ukraine, I developed 2 courses. The first is History of Soviet-Russia Relations, and the second, Strategies of Survival, the Energy, Technology, and Conservation History of Russia and Ukraine since Stalin. I'm using for this course a unique collection of documents which I translated from Russian and Ukrainian into English. It's publication from different Soviet periodicals and post-Soviet periodicals about American technology, including American energy, problems of American energy and conservation. One very interesting question for reports which KGB obliged all Soviet scholars who went to American Canada to bring back after their visit to United States and America. One of the major item was, what's new about American and Canadian technology you learned during your visit? Unfortunately, I had no access to KGB collection of all these reports. I have only a few of these reports from Presidium Академии наук in Ukrainian Academy of Sciences and Russian Academy of Sciences. But majority of these reports are in, of course, in KGB collections in both Sluzhba Bezpeki archives in Kiev and in Moscow archives. But I try to play with this question about technology and energy, and plus with serious publication about technology and energy in American Canada, which appeared in the 70s and 80s in Soviet periodicals, to engage my students in discussion of these issues of modernity in Soviet Union and how this model of Soviet modernity was compared with American model of modernity. So I have Soviet and post-Soviet history, 2 lectures and 2 seminars, only 2 lectures from the West and the world, and 2 courses, one on Russia, American relations, and about the energy, technology, and conservation, the history of Russia and Ukraine since Stalin. Another question, the major problems for me in these courses are different mentality and perception of economic life and political reality of my Midwestern American students, who could not understand how various post-Soviet countries, even in their regions, differ in their attitudes toward the energy and conservation. You already mentioned how Indiana University used Soviet model of wasting energy, so it's a very good example. Those countries with natural resources of gas and oil, such as Russia and Turkmenistan, have very different approaches to the problems of energy conservation than countries such as Ukraine or Lithuania. For example, in my seminar about energy after Chernobyl in post-Soviet states, I asked my students to find different internet sources and also sources from periodicals about how different was consumption of energy, for example, in Lithuania and in Ukraine from Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan and Russia. For example, major question for our discussion about these regional differences was comparison of Kazakhstan and Ukraine. Many students using very interesting sources during our seminar on their own, without my pushing them in this direction, discovered the fact that Kazakhstan is much richer, for example, than Ukraine. And that Ukraine used mostly American aid because Ukraine was number 4 recipient of American aid in the 90s, while Kazakhstan nowadays use its own resources and so on and so on. Another teaching challenge for me is to explain to my American students a legacy of culture of late socialism, and Peter Hartland already mentioned this legacy of late socialism in Russia. Legacy of the culture of late socialism in post-Soviet society, where new capitalism works through traditional and very personal connections and hierarchies of late socialism, including blood system. We have entire class devoted to these informal connections. And we discussed how these informal connections actually led to very dangerous tragedies, including Chernobyl, because if you analyze who controlled Chernobyl plant in 1986, 80% of these guys were appointed by Moscow, France. They belonged to this, through their connections to Kremlin bodies, they were connected to Kremlin's bodies and so on. And as a result, many of the mistakes were covered and so on and so on. And again, during our seminar about blood, about these informal connections, my students found information about this blood connection between Chernobyl administration and Moscow in American and British periodicals. Other question about solution that I have attempted and considered with what success for teaching these issues or covering these issues of energy and survival and conservation. The major solution that I have attempted was to change the style for discussion, and for this reason to change a required book for my students. In previous years, I used for the discussion chapters on the problems of energy, Chernobyl catastrophe, and energy conservation from various American textbooks on Soviet and post-Soviet history, such as Ronald Suni's and Peter Kenna's textbooks. Then I realized that material of these chapters was too abstract and remote from my students. I needed something more personal and connected to my American students' experience here at home in Indiana. The best solution for me the last year was an edition of handouts with chapters from Svetlana Alexievich, Voices from Chernobyl. It's a wonderful translation into English, the oral history of nuclear disaster, published first in 2006. We have different edition. It's a British edition, but you can find American edition. It's one of the best oral history devoted to Chernobyl. Moreover, two friends of mine actually gave an interview to Svetlana. They gone, unfortunately. So it's truly a great book. The second book, which I used, and you realize they are small for my students, is very important. If I give them more than 300, I have problems. So it's less than 300 pages. So it's very important for both state students. Another very important book is Dmitry Orlov book called Reinventing Collapse, the Soviet Example and American Prospects. It was published in 2008. Now, after reading the chapters from these books, my students had something personal to connect to, and this resulted in a very personal, lively discussion in my class. Moreover, as a former Soviet retired military officer, Chernobyl veteran, who spent 55 days in the Chernobyl zone during the summer of 1986, I usually share my personal experience, my pictures, etc. with my students during our discussion about Chernobyl catastrophe. So a combination of the oral history by Alexievich and my personal stories about my own experience in Soviet and post-Soviet Ukraine gives my students the opportunity to understand how post-social society deals with the problems of energy and conservation. The most important pedagogical strategy in my teaching was to stress the direct connections between stories of Soviet and post-Soviet problems with energy and conservation with the familiar American historical narrative. My students analyzed this comparison from Orlov's book about danger of dependence on oil production in the US and in the former Soviet geopolitical space, when the American cult of the middle class and automobile as a symbol of this class became fashionable. And this triggered more and more oil consumption in post-Soviet space. Actually, not only in post-Soviet space, as we realize, China also was affected by this prestige. For example, we discuss one phrase for this seminar about comparison between Soviet Union and United States. Dmitry Orlov is a physicist who actually worked in oil industry for many years in the United States. He came from, as a 12 years boy, he came from Soviet Union and he graduated from American school. But anyway, he now traveled back and forth between Russia and the United States, and he can compare Russian experience and American experience. And when he emphasized that sources of energy are limited, despite all our conversation that Russia still have these sources, Canada, United States. What is more important, Dmitry Orlov emphasized limited character of these sources and emphasize how important to limit consumption or wasting of these resources. And we already mentioned agricultural issues. He mentioned how dangerous Western agricultural system, especially in America, for wasting energy and wasting land instead of producing normal products, Americans growing soybeans, whatever, for energy issues. So when we discuss this and discuss what happened in Russia and Ukraine after 1986, how Soviet and then post-Soviet states struggle with issues of energy and how it affected political history of these countries. When students engage this narrative, they could use American images, American facts, and compare them with Ukrainian and Russian names, facts, and etc. Another danger discussed of my students was danger of nuclear power. For this discussion, I used not only Alexeyevich and Orlov's book and my personal experience of 1986, but also the material from my recent research on the history of American studies in the Soviet Union. I prepared for my students a special translation in English of the debates by Soviet scholars, the experts in US history, politics, and technology during the 1970s, the debates which were published on the pages of Soviet magazines, США «Экономика, политика, идеология», the USA «Economy, Politics, and Ideology», and «Искусство кино», the art of cinema, about the dangers and unpredictability of usage of nuclear power in the US during the 70s. Moreover, Soviet experts paid a special attention to the American movie The China Syndrome as early as late 1979 by director James Bridges and starring Jane Fonda, Jack Lemmon, and Michael Douglas. This film portrayed a real danger of the nuclear plant and attempts of this plant administration, as you remember, and Peter already mentioned this, to cover up the serious problems with the nuclear reactor. Paradoxically, this film was released around the USA on March 16, 1979. In an almost unbelievable coincidence, just 12 days later, on March 28, the worst nuclear accident in United States history occurred on 3 Mile Island near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The real-life incident in 3 Mile Island was in many ways identical to the plot of the movie. An incorrect reading of equipment at 3 Mile Island made the plant's operators think in error that there was more water covering the core of the power plant than there actually was. Just exactly what we see unfold on the screen in the China Syndrome. And our students, after watching this film and discussing Alexeyevich and other memoirs about Chernobyl, made comparison with situation in Soviet Ukraine in 1986. Soviet Americanists like Alexander Fursenko, who watched this film during his business trip in New York in 1979, recommended the Soviet government. He approached actually representatives of Sovkino Expert, special agency in Soviet Union which was in charge of buying foreign films, and recommended them to buy these films, of course, for ideological reasons. And first time in Soviet film industry, we have release of Китайский синдром in Russian translation, China's syndrome, as early as 1980. As a kid, I was a student in 1980. I watched this film with my friends and was thrilled with this. Of course, Alexander Fursenko argued that this film was made by progressively minded director, by peace movement activist Jane Fonda. Michael Douglas was son of Kirk Douglas, who was related to communist movement in the United States. So it was a leftist film for Soviet senses. But what is more important, this movie provoked a series of publications in Искусство кино, Art of Cinema, very specialized journal about filmmaking. And I made translation of these articles of 1980, 81, and my students were surprised how deep analysis of ecological problems was obvious on the pages of these articles. After its release in the USSR, this American movie became a sensation and was used not only for traditional criticism of American imperialism, but also for serious discussions about problems of energy, ecology, and conservation in many Soviet periodicals during 1980, 81, 82. Unfortunately, by 86, they forgot about this. Paradoxically, Chernobyl catastrophe of 1986 raised the similar concerns. Our students discussed this concern and problems of crisis of power, and again they used Alexievich memoirs, oral history project, and they used Dmitry Orlov. For example, the most important phrase from Orlov book about that this explosion of nuclear reactor severely shook belief in technical competence. The catastrophe awakened a latent and environmentalist sentiment within the population. These were the ancestral lands that were being made radioactive and uninhabitable for generations. Specialists with access to scientific equipment ceased to have faith in the veracity of official government research and began to make and exchange their own measurements of radioactivity and industrial pollutant levels. But another very important conclusion of our debate with my students who used these books, my documents, pictures, and American movie was that Chernobyl events contribute to the collapse of the USSR, especially to the rise of Ukrainian patriotism and criticism of Moscow control. Students in discussion made a conclusion that Ukrainian independence was a direct result of Chernobyl catastrophe. And we discuss another American book, which is not very thick. It's also less than 200 pages. It's Catherine Warner's book, Burden of Dreams, History and Identity in Post-Soviet Ukraine, and where Catherine Warner actually emphasized her observations about this role of Chernobyl catastrophe in triggering this rise of Ukrainian patriotism and this attempt to distancing from Moscow control. And we're not only reading these books and discussing chapters from Alexievich, Orlov, and Catherine Warner book, but also we're listening to rock music. And in both my large Soviet class and in small class, Soviet history class, I played the same very anti-Russian, very anti-Soviet, and forbidden by KGB song, composed by Lviv's band from it was composed in 1987. It's called Brаты Гадюкины, Snake Brothers. And only in 1990 KGB permitted them to release this album with this song. To finish my presentation about different strategies, I again emphasize that for my students who had no experience with foreigners sometimes, who never visited big cities, for me it was shock when I realized this. Even visit to Chicago or Indianapolis, for them it's a very important event. This exposure to foreign emotional moments, or foreign cultural practices like rock music in Ukrainian, or American movies which actually related to real universal problem of danger of nuclear energy, is very important. So these emotional issue and such emotional matters like films and music sometimes help more than boring lecture about numbers of people who died in Fukushima, after Fukushima, or in Ukraine and Latvia, Belarus, and Russia after Chernobyl. Do you mind if I play this? So usually I start with this emotional introduction, especially for my large class, and I give them translation of this lyrics. But now I will tell you just 2 words about this song. So it's this song is called Mama, Prepare Me a Very Good Wedding. And it's very ironic. For many Ukrainians, Chernobyl catastrophe was related to huge radiation which affected sexual activities of the people. And this song is about how all Ukraine disappeared because of radiation. People died because they still eating poisoned bread. They drinking poisoned water, and even their weddings and their marriages are empty because they couldn't produce children because their health is affected by Chernobyl. But anyway, it should be fun. Mama, prepare us very good wedding. We would drink and forget about Moscow and other things. It's second. Again, many of you who know Western rock music realize that this is based, vaguely speaking, on AC/DC tune. But anyway, it's again, it's 1987. And it's KGB for the you'll be arrested. Lyrics is great. They start with this philosophical question: what happened with Ukraine? It's the beginning or the end? Something strange came to Ukraine. And again, the reprise in this song is presented with these German words, ein, zwei, drei, and that is again its attempt to distance themselves from Moskali, from people from Moscow. Again, it's not just nationalism, it's healthy Ukrainian patriotism, attempt to protect our Ukrainian land from the stupid interference from Kremlin when people in Ukraine are dying and nobody cares in Moscow. So this song, again based vaguely on a CDC tune, is a great reminder for us of tragedy of this energy problem in Soviet Union. Again, they use also folk elements, and millions of us listen to this song. Even the Russian speaking like myself thought, no, we need to go far from Moscow because now it's too dangerous. And nobody believed in perestroika. I don't. Again, for you it's very difficult to understand. But after '86, people in Ukraine tried to make their own identity, and with many other events, especially with creation of the rock movement in 1988. Even the Russian-speaking and Russia-oriented intellectuals in Ukraine create their own non-Moscow, non-Russian identity in Ukraine. Thank you very much.